Hello, I'm Mauro Guillen. I'm a professor at the Wharton School, and today I'm having a conversation with Professor Barbara Mellers, who has appointments both in the psychology department at Penn and also in the Wharton School within the marketing department. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mauro. It's great to be here.
So yesterday you lectured to our class of students on forecasting, especially in the context of the pandemic. And I'd like to ask you initially a very simple question, which is, in your research, you have found that human beings are not very good at forecasting. So could you explain a little bit what your research is about and the main findings about human forecasting?
Okay. The research in psychology and other fields has shown that when you compare intuitive forecasts, intuitive judgments against simple statistical models, the simple statistical models outperform humans virtually all the time. Now, there's a few exceptions, and those are interesting. They're ones in which people know something that the model doesn't know. Paul Meehl, who was a brilliant psychologist and worked on this problem, called it the broken leg syndrome. And this is, for example, suppose you're trying to predict whether someone will go to the movies on Friday night. And this person always goes to the movies on Friday night. Well, if you happen to know that he has a broken leg and is in the hospital, you know quite well that he won't be going to the movie that night, this Friday night. And that's just an example of a case in which the human knows something that's not incorporated into the model. So people are much better at changing things quickly as opposed when the world changes, as opposed to models that are extrapolation based. What's the human record for forecasting? Well, we don't know. It would be interesting to find out. And of course, it depends on the difficulty of the questions. It depends on the skills of the forecasters. And I think we're really at the beginning of this kind of research. We're learning more and more about what people can do when they're put in environments that are conducive to learning. That means they have many opportunities to practice and to try out different strategies. And each time they're given feedback, clear, crisp feedback that tells them whether they're right or wrong. We have that in our forecasting tournaments. So, as I said, I think that we're really early in this research, and hopefully we'll see people doing better and better.
One of the most striking findings that you shared with us yesterday was that experts, right, in a particular field don't always have more accurate predictions or forecasts than people who, have certain characteristics, right? Could you explain to our audience how that works? Why is that the case that experts sometimes are not as good as other people at making forecasts?
Yes. There's plenty of evidence of that in financial investing, in political judgments, expert political judgments about what will happen in the not too distant future. One of the things that people are bad at is combining lots of pieces of information and coming up with an overall judgment that's valid and reliable. That means it correlates with some criterion variable of interest, and it's fairly stable. That is, if we saw the same information on two different occasions, we'd say the same thing. And unfortunately, we don't do that. Now, there's lots of cases where that is the task, when physicians are putting pieces of information together to determine a diagnosis, or Mauro, when you and your colleagues are sitting down to decide which graduate students or which applicants to select for graduate school, you're putting together lots of pieces of information about them. And it's just extremely difficult for us to do. And I think people don't have the humility that they ought to have given the data. I think if we knew how many errors, how many mistakes we did make in predictions, we would take ourselves a little less seriously and look for a bit more help. Even something simple in the form of, back in the old days, there were personal digital assistants, PDAs, that were offered to physicians, and they went over like a lead balloon. People just did not want to be bothered with this computer model that suggested what a diagnosis might be relative to their own intuitions. We like our intuitions. We believe them.
Yeah, but they're not accurate, right, about the future. That's
Exactly.
the problem. Now, in your research, you find that forecasters learn over time, right? So they become better at it. Could you explain a little bit how that works?
Yes. When we were working on designing forecasting tournaments and finding out what were the best environments that we could create, a couple of things stood out and replicated year after year after year. Social environments in which people can share information, discuss different points of view, work through them, encourage each other to participate. Hey, Joe, we haven't heard from you for the last week or so. Is everything going okay? Do you want to tell us what your view is on question number 257? That kind of engagement really helps. And I think that in a virtual case, virtual workspace, it's quite good. We've had situations where people are all over the world. They're coming in. They're sequentially engaging with the material, and they see other people's forecasts. They see other people's rationales, and they think through, okay, how does this relate to what I just found out from reading The Economist or some journal? Those are good working environments. They're better than having people work alone. And when there's feedback, and especially opportunities to discuss your point of view, it's a conducive a conducive environment to learning how to forecast better.
Yeah, now, yesterday you made a very strong statement about verbal uncertainty phrases and how confusing they can become. So whenever, people say, well, there's a good chance that this may happen, right? Could you explain exactly why, especially in the context of a crisis such as this, we shouldn't be making forecasts based or communicating them using verbal uncertainty phrases?
Yeah. It's our standard way of communicating. And in fact, it's exactly what the intelligence community still does, despite the research that we and other people have done. First of all, it can be misleading. If you say something is possible, it's possible that we'll have additional outbreaks of COVID if we open up too soon. That is a word that has a wide range of plausible interpretations, going from about 20% to about 80%. So you could interpret possible or plausible as likely or unlikely. And there are two other words that are vague and conducive to misunderstanding. The other point about verbal terms that is very important is that you can't learn to get better if you're using words like maybe, could happen, possible, impossible. These are words that you can't score these kinds of communications. And so you cannot see whether a different strategy makes you more or less accurate. Now, I think some of the most profound changes that we as a civilization have been able to make are in cases where we devise metrics for improvement, and we use those to push and tinker and see what works better. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with forecasting. And we can't do it if we don't have an accuracy metric against which to compare different strategies, different elicitation techniques, so forth. So, no, words aren't going to help us. They're comfortable, they're familiar, but they're not going to cut it, especially when we have disasters and pandemics and crises of the sort we have now.
Yeah, so my last question for you is, yesterday you said that there's really no silver bullet. There's no, single way of improving forecasting, but it has to be a battery of things. So from research, we know that there's a number of things that in combination may help us produce better forecasts.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit that logic?
Sure. We have looked at elicitation methods, different forms of incentives, different accuracy metrics, different ways in which forecasters interact, and so forth. And with many different things, you could get a little bit of an additional boost, maybe an extra 10% from coming up with a training module that teaches people a little bit how to think probabilistically, use the internet to search for information. If you have two different predictions, perhaps, and you think they're equally credible, perhaps you just want to average them to get a single estimate. I think that, again, there's no silver bullet because situations differ. And in the case of geopolitical forecasting, we found that prediction markets were just about as good as what we call prediction polls, which are forms of surveys where we ask people to make predictions. But with prediction markets, we couldn't devise a training module that helped people get better. We could with surveys, but we were unable to after 4 years of trying with prediction markets. With surveys, we could discover who the right people were to participate. We found lots of variables that correlated with good forecasting. With prediction markets, we couldn't find them. And I'm still curious about why this is the case. I would love to do more research on this. But the upshot is there's lots of little behavioral and statistical interventions that will, taken together, lead to something that's important. And so, yeah, that's my statement on that. No single silver bullet. But
yeah, but there are ways. Yeah, but there are ways.
Yes.
Exactly, there are ways that little steps, in other words, that combined, they add up to big improvements in the accuracy
Yes.
of
Right.
forecasting. Now, I think it will not escape our listeners that having accurate forecasts about the future of this pandemic will be very, very important when it comes to, for example, being able to reopen the economy in a safe way, or to reopen university campuses in a safe way.
Right.
So I have one last question for you, which is more of an information point. You have an ongoing tournament right now where people can participate and they can try out different strategies for
That's
making
right.
forecasts about
Yes.
the future evolution of this pandemic. So could you
Right.
explain to us where on the internet they can go to and how they can
Yes.
become members of this big study that you're undertaking?
Yes, and Mauro, thank you so much for giving me a chance to invite our alum to join the COVID-19 forecasting tournament. The Penn Group, is involved in another IARPA tournament, forecasting tournament, and part of the research on this is a forecasting tournament to predict fatalities, to predict the effects of interventions, and to look at relationships between counterfactual questions where you can't resolve the question by looking at reality, seeing how people's mental models with the counterfactual questions correlate with accurate forecasting. So we would love to have all of you participate if you're interested in a new forecasting tournament. You can go to the website. It is GJP for Good Judgment Project, and followed by the number 2.org, O-R-G, /UPenn. So I'll say that once more. GJP, the number 2.org, /UPenn. And we welcome you. Please, if you're interested in this, please join before the weekend is over, because we want to launch people into the tournament right away and get them involved. And it works better to do it in a big batch. So thank you, Maura, for giving me a chance to tell our alum about that.
Yes, thank you so much for that information. And I would like to reiterate that it would be very, very interesting and actually important for alums to participate in your research project. And I think they can also learn quite a bit from the experience of participating in the tournament.
Yeah.
So this was Professor Barbara Mellers from the Psychology Department and the Marketing Department at Wharton, talking to us about forecasting and how to become better at forecasting. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us today.